So we're going to take some time today to talk a little bit about leadership beyond boundaries in colleges and universities. But before we get too far into that conversation, I'd like to remind us a little bit of some advice that Lao Tzu provided us. And what he said was, do the difficult things while they are easy, and do the great things while they are small. A journey of 1,000 miles must start with the first step. So we have this massive task ahead of us, this massive vision in Leadership Beyond Boundaries, which is to, in a perfect world, we would like to see every young person have leadership development. We imagine what the world would look like if that were the case. And part of that involves possibly, reforming education. And these are massive, massive objectives for us to try and hit. So we have to remember, let's take it one step at a time. Now, I used to work at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and while I spent time in that higher ed setting, this is my experience. It might not be everybody's experience, but I actually saw that leadership development for college students tended to sort of pivot around one of these two questions. And the question is whether higher education was focused more on helping students learn about leadership, which is good, that's fine, or is higher education focused on helping students learn how to lead? Now, those sound like they might be very similar things, but actually, from an educational perspective, to achieve one or to achieve the other requires different strategies. Now, one of the things that in some of my doctoral research I came across was there are quite a few studies that actually looked at how often the word leadership comes up in university mission statements and or vision statements. And these are mostly United States-based universities, so I'm not going to say this is necessarily global. But it shows up in thousands of mission statements. And when it shows up in these mission statements, typically it is from the perspective of when students graduate from this institution, we are providing leaders for the world. We are going to make the world a better place. The idea isn't that they're teaching students a little bit about leadership while they're in the university. It's that they are learning how to lead there so that when they graduate, they can make an impact. So the question is, are the educational processes that are in place accomplishing that objective? Now, one of the things that we see often is that in university settings, there tends to be a reliance on what we might colloquially call the broadcast model of education. And that's where you have a professor in the front of the room lecturing to a bunch of students who have their antennas up, trying to pick up the message that's being broadcast from the front of the room. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily bad, but let's think about the implications as it relates to leadership development, because often in these types of educational settings, what you get is a heavy emphasis on theory and maybe the history of leadership studies. There's going to be more lecture, most likely, and there's going to be some extensive reading and research papers, and we may see that there's some testing for comprehension, and maybe most significantly is that these tend to be standalone leadership classes. Of course, we're focusing on the curricular side here. These are standalone leadership classes that aren't necessarily integrated in with other disciplines. So leadership is kind of this thing that happens all by itself. But then I learn engineering, and that's something that happens all by itself. And then I go over to, history or whatever. And that's, so the idea is that these things are not nested. They are actually separated out. But in the real world, all of this stuff is happening simultaneously. And so that's one of those questions is this really helping them learn how to lead? Well, it's probably teaching them some good things about leadership, but it may not be what is necessary to help students learn how to be more effective leaders. And at CCL and in LBB, we have some thoughts about that. So what does it take to really help students learn how to lead? Well, we would say that first and foremost, leadership development is relational and it's transformational. There are opportunities to learn with and from other people. And there are transformational experiences that force people out of their comfort zones and make them stretch and grow. And through those experiences, people actually develop. And in conjunction with that, from a pedagogical perspective, we also want to have knowledge acquisition. Now, we were talking about knowledge acquisition earlier when we were talking about all the testing and things. But here what we're talking about is the balance, or the ratio, between the amount of knowledge that is put forth and the practice and the reflection that goes in concert with that knowledge. So what we would propose is that giving a bite-sized nugget, something like a leadership essential that we have, and then giving the students an opportunity to practice that and reflect on their practice and practice again and reflect on that practice. And through that process, what students learn are new ways to think and new ways to behave. And that's where growth happens. So if these processes are not part of the learning model, then the potential to have that impact is lessened. So what we would say is, for higher education to have the leader development impact that it wants to have, these are processes that need to be incorporated into their teaching to make that result happen. Now, if we think about this in a little bit more sort of narrative form, we can articulate it thus. Fostering leader development is an inherently relational and transformative process that leverages knowledge acquisition, practice, and reflection to inspire new thinking and behavior. This is the essence of what we do in Leadership Beyond Boundaries. This is why we design programs the way we design them. This is why we invest the time in capacity development, is to help educators learn how to do that effectively. It's the core of who we are. It's why we do what we do, because we believe that this is absolutely essential for leaders to grow and develop. Now, here's the challenge. So we have this nice castle. It's this wonderful, archaic, massive structure that has been around for generations upon generations. But let's not look at that right now as a castle. Let's imagine that's the world of academia. Because like this castle, it's been around for generations and generations. And it's got walls that are every bit as tall and well guarded and resistant to outside forces. So the question that we have sometimes, those of us that work in college and university settings, is how do we walk up with our backpacks and stride up to the front of that thing and knock on that massive door and say, "Hello, sirs, could we please make a difference in your world?" And if we approach them the wrong way, we might even end up with a situation like this, where we have many various objects and animals like ducks and things like that raining down on us. And that is not what we want. We don't want to have to run away. We want to find a way to come together. And so we do a lot of work to try and find a middle ground, somewhere where we can meet. But you know, academia can be tough. And just to exemplify how tough academia can be, think about this. This is Christine Ortiz, and she is a dean at MIT. And she's actually going to be leaving MIT soon to start her own university. And she's starting a university that is not going to have lectures, and it's not going to have classrooms. Basically, what she's saying is, in order for students to grow and develop in the modern professional age, the emphasis needs to be on the practice. It needs to be on the work. The knowledge acquisition needs to come, and then the practice, and then the reflection will help them grow and develop much more effectively than if some sage stands on the stage and tells them the things that they think they need to know. If you want to elicit new thinking and new behaviors, you create learning opportunities where students can expand and grow. Now, in her vision of a university, there will be no classroom lectures. Actually, lectures are going to be handled online. and they're going to be modular. So instead of it just being a film of somebody else already doing a lecture in a classroom, it's actually going to be condensed, and it's going to have action points in there, opportunities to have active learning while they are going through the lecture online. And the curriculum, the core feature of the curriculum is going to be the project itself. Instead of the way classes are currently structured, where you might have a core curriculum and then a project's kind of a peripheral item, for this, the project is the central feature. And they're longer term projects, more like graduate work projects than what typically show up in undergrad settings, because students can be immersed more deeply in the work. The classrooms are not going to be like traditional classrooms. It's actually not going to be a classroom at all. It's going to be a large open lab space for people to be able to work. And the reason that is so important is because in order for people to learn with and from one another, they have to have the space and the setting to be able to do that. And the way current classrooms are constructed, they're optimal for viewing one person at the front of the room. They are not optimal for group work. And then finally, the educational culture that she wants to establish is going to be transdisciplinary. So instead of having professors that are divided by departments and disciplines, they're actually going to work together in interdependent fashion, because she recognizes that in order to produce students that are able to function in an interdependent world, the culture that they come from is going to be very important for them to grow and develop. And so by creating a transdisciplinary educational culture, she's fostering in them the awareness and the values that come from interdisciplinary learning. And finally, one of the real challenges of current educational systems, at least higher ed, is the tenure system. And she is going to find an alternative way to entice professors into this world, not one based on tenure. And there are folks that have kind of scoffed at this and have said, well, how do you expect to bring top quality educators in here if you're not going to offer tenure? And she said, I'm not really worried about that, because I have seen literally hundreds of absolutely brilliant graduate students who have moved into their professional worlds that want to teach, that can't find a job because they're faculty members that have been sitting in their current roles for over 40 years. She said they're hungry for something new and for something different, and we believe that this gives them an opportunity to expand those wings. Now, we don't have to necessarily completely go in a different direction from college, the current higher ed system, to make a difference. We do think that there is some middle ground there, and we've actually had the opportunity to tread some of that middle ground. And one of the tools that can be really helpful for this are our leadership essentials. And what our goal is to take these leadership essentials and figure out ways to integrate them into the curriculum in such a way that it creates meaningful learning. We don't just plug in leadership essentials at the front end of the class and hope that students are going to learn that stuff and then they'll apply it regularly throughout the rest of the semester. It just doesn't happen that way. There needs to be thoughts about how these essentials get embedded. Remember, knowledge acquisition, bite-sized pieces, opportunities to practice that learning, opportunities to reflect on that practice. If we do that, then we can create meaningful leadership development opportunities in the midst of regular curricula. And that's what we actually have done at SMU. And I'm not going to go through the diagram that's up here in any extensive way, but what I will say is this diagram shows a process methodology that enables us to provide relational interactions with students and professors. It gives transformative challenges to them. It supplies them with knowledge pieces like leadership essentials at appropriate times during the semester, and then they get to practice and reflect on that throughout this entire model. Now, what we're going to do is take a moment to have a professor from SMU share a little bit about what his perspectives have been within this classroom.
I think there's an unfortunate mindset among engineering faculty and a lot of other faculty also that leadership development is not necessarily something that should be or can be easily integrated into their classes. We fight every day the amount of curricular material that we have to cover, and how do we cover it in the amount of time that we are given. And so there's this automatic assumption that if I add something to the course, I'm going to necessarily have to jettison something else, which almost from an engineering perspective makes complete and logical sense. I have a finite amount of time. I have a material. If I add material, I have to get rid of something else in that finite amount of time. The interesting thing with this class is that through integrating some fantastic process methodologies for the design challenge and helping students understand who and what they are as a contributing member of a team, we actually saw that the team production, work product of the team was improved by the fact that they were a more functional team. And because they were able to work better and faster, they ended up having more time to work, and that allowed them to produce, at least what in my opinion, is substantially more impressive engineering output. Because the teams worked better as teams, it accelerated the ability of the class to move along its pace rather than hinder it by perhaps requiring us to jettison some material.
So when I hear Mark talking about jettisoning material, it reminds me back of the Monty Python thing where they're throwing stuff out of the castle. So you know, if we think about this, then often there's this assumption that if we include something like leadership development into the classroom, that then it's going to get in the way of other learning. And what he actually is telling us is the opposite. That by incorporating leadership development, by integrating it into the classroom, it accelerated learning because the students were working more effectively with one another. They were working more efficiently with one another. They had a higher degree of trust of working with one another, so they would try things that they maybe wouldn't try if they're worried about being ridiculed. So all of those things add up to incremental gains in the educational space. Now, a couple of the other things are they also recognize, students reported that they recognized the intersection between leadership and engineering, and that they saw how important that was. And what's really interesting is when we did, way back when we first started our pilot work with them, we had some leadership essentials that, as I said earlier, that we incorporated at the beginning of the class, and then through the process of the semester they forgot about it, and it wasn't effective at all, and they didn't see any value in it whatsoever, whereas with this approach, they did. Now, the work that we did at SMU, we also have done at another university here in North Carolina. And it's with a different type of university setting, whereas Southern Methodist University is a relatively small private institution. This is a much larger school, and the classes that they have are much larger than the ones at SMU. And what we found was they had so many classes, in fact, that they didn't want to switch all of the classes over to this new model. And so we ended up having half of the courses roughly running with the traditional project-based model, and half of the new classes, what we call the modified classes now, that we're using what we call this Scrum approach. And this gave us a really good opportunity to see to do a bake-off. So let's see, let's compare head-to-head how these did, because at SMU we did not have the opportunity to do that. We switched them all over at the same time. And what we found was students in the modified courses rated the class experience more favorably. They were significantly more positive about all aspects of class related to perceptions of support, of enjoyment, and of engagement. And the engagement piece is really, really important because that is something that's connected a little bit toward students' interest in the work. And you can see down below, we also have higher levels of excitement about taking other engineering courses. And in engineering, retention is such a major issue that if we are seeing results that are showing more engaged students, more excited students, that's something that we definitely want to build on. Now, in addition to their interest in the course matter, they also reported statistically significantly higher scores on practicing problem solving, on suggesting innovative solutions, and on teams' completion of assignments on time. So those three categories are also really important as it relates to workforce preparedness, because people that are hiring engineers from the graduate ranks are, one of the things that these employers are consistently saying is, we need people that are going to be able to think for themselves, that are going to be creative, and can get the work done in the way we need them to be able to manage themselves and work effectively within a team. And so all of these three outcomes are targeting on exactly those three things. So that's exciting. But then also, in addition to these, something that was exciting is if we look now at the chart that's on the left, that is the grade, the percentage of distribution of grades across the modified and the standard classes for this general engineering course. And the orange bars represent the modified classes, the blue bars represent the standard classes. And what I might do first of all is we notice that both the A's and the B's up there are pretty similar. And what I might say very quickly is, if anybody that is taught kind of knows that oftentimes you have a group of students in there that are going to get A's and B's. Almost in spite of you, they will get A's and B's. And so that's great. We're wonderful, and we're thankful that we have these students. But let's take a look at the red box, because that's maybe where the more interesting story is. If we look at the blue bars in there, we'll see a fairly consistent distribution across there, where we're ranging between roughly 10 or 11% of either C's, D's, or F's all the way across the board. And unfortunately, F's are the highest of the three at about 15 or 16%. And I should also note that these classes, because we have different numbers in the modified classes versus the standard classes, we're looking at percentages here as opposed to frequencies. And what we see, though, when we compare the blue bars there to the orange modified classes, is we have a much nicer trend showing in the modified classes. Now, the F's are still maybe higher than we want them to be, but sometimes that's going to happen. But if we look at the D's, we notice that the D's are below 5%. And those scores that maybe were D's in the standard class have moved over into the C column, right? And so now we've got, as opposed to having only 11% getting C's, we have roughly somewhere around 18 or 19% getting C's. And that's really exciting too, because that speaks well, again, to students having greater confidence in their ability to produce and just having a better result in the class as it is. And as we said before, they're producing better work. You heard that from both our professor that was speaking earlier from SMU, and it's showing up here in the grades. Now, as promising as these results are, there is a shadow side that is somewhat challenging, and this is something that we're trying to figure out right now in LBB. It's one of the things that makes leadership development so interesting but also so challenging, and that is, as promising as these results are, how do we pollinate this to other faculty and other schools? Right now we have an NSF grant that we have put a proposal in for. We haven't heard back on how that is going to come. We also have a manuscript under review for publication that references the data that I shared with you earlier. And we wonder what other ideas might be out there to help us move this message and these practices and processes more broadly into the educational system. Another challenge, though, is scale. Scaling these processes present challenges because we need tools and supporting resources that will ease the torque of implementation. We need to provide faculty guidance on how to effectively divide a project into these sprints or these different subsegments that we use to help move this process forward, because you can't just simply go, okay, I'm going to put a dividing line here and a dividing line there. There needs to be some thought and intentionality behind how that is done. And then we also need to help faculty learn how to more effectively explain this process to students, and also help them be better coaches to students as they go through this work. And Are there digital resources that we can develop and that could be deployed in service of this work? Because one of the real challenges is implementation costs. When we have to be there on site, it costs a considerable amount of money to keep us on site for days at a time to help train these processes and implement these processes. So how can we create digital resources that might be able to complement that and help this run more independently than it has to currently? However, if those of us like us here at LBB and Christine Ortiz and other like-minded thinkers out there interested in revolutionizing education, if we can address these challenges, then the workforce will receive students that are more developmentally ready for the challenges of the modern professional age and society. And in addition to that, developing youth as educators, but developing youth and educators as leaders will help us create a more nimble, forward-thinking world for all. And that's really a core value to who we are here at Leadership Beyond Boundaries. I think that's, to some degree, what's motivating Christine Ortiz, is that idea of how do we make the world a better place. And that is a massive responsibility. So maybe the one thing that we can keep in mind is we're not going to solve everything all at once, but we need to find like-minded thinkers. We need to trust in our colleagues. We need to trust in the people around us that have the same awareness and interests, and know that it's going to happen because the journey of 1,000 miles begins one step at a time. So thank you.